The Galien Foundation, Jerusalem Ethics Forum, and Medable welcome you to this important discussion on inclusive medicine, how modern research can amplify outcomes for patient access, inclusion, and diversity. My name is Sanskriti Thakur. I'm your moderator. I'm also the Chief Growth Officer at Medable. There has never been more potential in our industry centered around patient access, inclusion, and diversity than there is today. Traditional approaches have long been responsible for the creation of quite amazing scientific innovation, but barriers continue to have unintended effects of diminishing access. Today, 70% of potential participants still live more than 2 hours away from a clinical trial site where others are never made aware or afforded research opportunities. Even in the recent pandemic coronavirus disease, 2019 has disproportionately impacted marginalized communities across the United States. Additionally, racial, ethnic minority, and elderly populations experiencing the highest COVID-19 incidence, hospitalization, and mortality rates have not been equitably enrolled in clinical trials investigating potential therapeutics. This has been studied by a number of institutions and recently reported in the Journal of General Internal Medicine, which evaluated 310 biomedical therapeutics across 2,095 trial sites. Then and now, this means that medicines are not made for everyone. The emphasis we place on treatment should equal the emphasis we place on treatment for all. And for that reason, we are here to discuss how to overcome this inherent bias. With the momentum, awareness, and technology today, we are poised to at least act to remedy this situation. We have modern methods, including digital ones, enabling novel, hybrid, decentralized, and patient-centric approaches that have resulted in new ways of evaluating data and demonstrating reliable alternatives that might exist. It's with this in mind, I'd like to introduce the extremely qualified and honored and humbled to be here with this expert-filled panel, which has spent almost all of their lives in one way or the other, from an academic perspective, industry perspective, or as clinicians, making medicines inclusive for all people, regardless of their geography, biology, or economics. I'd like to introduce Sapna McManus, Head of Patient Inclusion and Equity at Genentech, Ken Getz, the Director and Associate Professor, Founder and Board Chair at Tufts, and Yele Aluko, the Chief Medical Officer at Ernst & Young. I will hand it to the panelists to tell us a little bit more about why this topic is meaningful to them before we head into the panel discussion. Sapna, let's start with you.
Thank you, Sans. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today. It is morning for me, and I am located in Texas. It's a little bit early, but this is going to be such an inspiring and thought-provoking discussion. And we, have been dealing with this issue for pretty much as long as I can remember. I trained outside the United States, and I'm a clinician by background. And part of my exposure was to patients who didn't necessarily have access and affordability in India, as well as the huge burden of infectious disease. And who knew that one day I would be in a setting where all of those factors came into play. Fast forward many years down the line, I moved to the United States as an immigrant and met and married someone who was an active duty Air Force service person, and had the chance to actually move to small towns and observe the care that's delivered to military personnel, which is also in many ways disparate in itself. And we see all the care challenges that veterans have, with most veterans living in rural areas. So as a spouse of a veteran, that is part of the care that I've also been able to observe. And living in the South and working primarily in Louisiana, there were a lot of inequities in the system in the way that care was delivered and accessed. And I firmly believe that innovation can't come without access. The two must go hand in hand, which is why this discussion today is so important. I joined Genentech about 15 years ago in their medical affairs area and have been with the company since. And in the last 6 months, based on our heightened awareness of just the widening disparities in COVID, I came on board into our Chief Diversity Office with a special focus on patient inclusion. And so I hope to share a few of those views today with this wonderful panel.
Thanks, Sapna. What about you, Ken?
I also want to extend good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, and I thank the Galien Foundation and Medable for the invitation to be part of this really important meeting and participant in this panel. I have about 35 years of professional experience as an observer, as an educator, as essentially an outsider gathering data and information about the drug development and clinical research enterprise. For a very long time, my primary audience was clinical research professionals, but beginning about 20 years ago, we started to receive more and more inquiries from patient advocacy groups and patient communities eager to have a seat at the table, to look at the data, to understand the data and information, and to become an active partner in the clinical research process. And so about 20 years ago, I founded a nonprofit, the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, that is dedicated to providing outreach and education to the public and patient communities, and to essentially translate clinical research information into meaningful and relevant information that patients can use to partner with the drug development community. So we're dedicated to improving patient engagement, and clearly the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of patient engagement is essential to the work that we do. And I look forward to sharing what we're learning and some of the key practical ways that we can address the disparities, the deep disparities that exist today. So again, I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, Ken. And now, Dr. Aluko.
Yes, I want to echo the appreciation to be part of this very important panel and this very important and timely topic and conversation. So for me, this is very personal. I'll tell you why. I'm a cardiologist, and in my cardiology training, I did a number of fellowships. First one was in New York City, in an academic medical center. And I was one of 2 African-American fellows within a total of 20 cardiology fellows. And we both struggled as African-Americans to get involved in clinical research because the attractive research protocols and trials were assigned to other people. And we, after about 6 months, realized that we were being relegated to the more mundane types of clinical trials, and we were actually an afterthought. So I had a very, very early awakening that there was some systemic impediments for people like myself getting involved in clinical research. So fast forward about a couple of years, when I was doing my interventional fellowship in Massachusetts, again in the Northeast, I was the only senior cardiology fellow doing interventional procedures. And after 6 months, it occurred to me that I had done just one interventional procedure on an African-American person who happened to be an executive at Kodak. And that began my thinking around issues of access or lack thereof, particularly when cardiovascular disease was then and still is the #1 killer of African Americans. There was a paradox around the fact that a vulnerable population was not able to get access to myself that was able to deliver sophisticated procedures and treatments. I practiced cardiovascular medicine for 25 years before joining EY, where I am now as Chief Medical Officer. Throughout my career, I noticed these issues about access disparities, difficult outcomes, and systemic drivers that perpetuated what we're trying to solve for now. So this is very personal for me, and I'm happy to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Aluko, Dr. Getz, Dr. McManus for being here. Let's begin this really important conversation. We have seen incredible behaviors in the last 2 years, given the challenges of a global pandemic. We have observed vaccines coming to market in less than 12 months, where we never thought that would ever be possible in our industry. We have watched our economies, in a sense, crumble, and inequities yet continue. Given this environment, the heightened awareness that we have today, what are the necessary changes that you would ask us to take based on the learnings from the pandemic to improve access and inclusion, specifically in scientific research and in clinical trials? Ken, let's begin with you.
What a powerful and important question for us to begin our conversation as a panel. And I would begin by suggesting that the pandemic has essentially brought into clearer focus so many of the fundamental problems that have existed long before we've faced this global health crisis. And if anything, they have helped to elevate some of the real challenges that we face. So to your point, Sans, clearly the pandemic has measurably impacted public and patient awareness of clinical research and the role that it is playing in developing treatments and vaccines for COVID in particular, but also raised general awareness across other disease conditions. But at the same time, the speed with which we have developed treatments and vaccines to address this global health crisis and the incredible proliferation of information in social media, in fact, a lot of misinformation has really diminished willingness to participate in clinical research, and that is far more pronounced in underrepresented and minority communities. So that's a major challenge. It's elevated the lack of trust, particularly in minority communities. So we really now face even greater challenges in attracting minority participants in our studies. And as we're starting to see now, we're also seeing the exit of a large number of healthcare providers who are now burnt out within this environment. The last 2 years at the Tufts Center, we've been conducting a number of studies that build on a lot of great work in the literature that looks at disparities by disease condition, that really measures this lack of trust and the limited awareness and understanding in public and patient communities. Our most recent studies really try to quantify the magnitude of disparities, and we've looked at all drugs and biologics that have been approved over the last 15 years, and we see very high level of disparity with no improvement, particularly among Black participants and those who are of African descent. That has not improved over this time period. And we see very poor level of completeness of data in our pivotal trials that really characterizes the race and ethnicity of our participants in our studies and of our population subgroups. So this really begins to put into focus some of the critical areas that we need to address and that we'll discuss moving forward. One other area I want to touch on is a recent study we just completed trying to measure the relationship between investigative site personnel diversity and the diversity of patients enrolled in clinical trials. And we've now shown very, very strong correlation. And all of this speaks to not only the critical importance of awareness and education, but structural shortcomings in the places where we conduct research, and in the diversity of site personnel, and how do we attract a more diverse community of research professionals, as well as some of the regulatory shortcomings that I know we'll discuss as well. So I'll stop there just to help set the stage.
Dr. McManus, I'd love to move to you now. As you've observed the progress or change or lack of progress in industry, could you share with us how your company or your view of the industry is taking action with what we've learned in the pandemic, and what are the different outcomes that you seek to achieve?
Absolutely, Sans. And I want to kind of double down on what Dr. Aluko said earlier, which is that the opportunities that are available to, physicians who are physicians of color or other types of opportunities, we need to sort of look at the condition and find out the drivers of why these things are happening. And then we need to tackle those things. So at Genentech, we've looked at a couple of things. It's not enough just to look at clinical trials. We recognize that is, we're an innovator, a manufacturing company. So certainly that is an area of growth and progress for us. But that's not enough. If only 7% of physicians in the United States are African American, we have a problem. And so, that problem is something that we don't want to contribute to. It's something that we actually want to address, identify and address. I think all physicians can understand that you first have to understand the root of the disease, and then you have to diagnose it, and then you treat it. And so we're looking at our own report card on our own employees. We employ a large number of scientists and engineers and STEM fields. So we're looking at our own people as, who do we hire? Are we hiring people that are African American? Are we hiring Latinx individuals into the company? Are we diversifying the pipeline of STEM candidates? And so we have programs where we invest into kindergarten through careers programs, because that systemic bias starts very, very early from young children all the way through to high school and college and graduate level selection. So that's one area that we are strongly focused on is the pipeline. Another area that we are really thinking deeply about and acting upon is diversifying our own clinical trial. We want to increase the representation of African American and Latinx patients in all of our trials. So we have taken some specific and measurable actions. And the reason for that is you can't have anything that's sustainable if you don't measure it. And if you measure something, then you're accountable for it. So the very first thing that we're doing is we're attempting to incorporate molecule-specific inclusive actions into every protocol. We are also measuring those, and then we have looked at our protocols. Simple things can exclude patients from clinical trials. We've been designing protocols the same way for 30, 40 years. So a BMI or a liver function panel, just a couple of points off could exclude a whole cadre of individuals that may be African American or Latinx. And so we're going back and making modifications to those protocols. The other thing we're doing is we have a site alliance with sites that are known to have underrepresented minorities and are working in this space. They're leaders in this space. They're not just enrolling patients, but they're working with their own communities of Black and Latinx patients to, one, build community trust. So we did a landmark health equity study where we surveyed 1,000 patients who were not patients of color, and then about 1,000 patients who were identified as Black and Latinx. And those patients said to us a number of very revealing things. So one of the things that they said is they believe not only that there are iniquities in the system, but they believe that the system is actively rigged against them. And when we surveyed about 400 healthcare providers, even those healthcare providers said that misinformation is exacerbating the distrust, that there are gaps in the patient-provider relationship, and that positive trusting relationship that people assume would happen between a healthcare provider and the patient doesn't really exist. And so when we think about a medically disenfranchised population and not having trust, that is an area that we are actively seeking to build as industry. And I think it requires multiple hands to make this work actually come to fruition. It has to involve industry, policymakers, healthcare providers, and government really to make all of this work possible.
Thank you, Sapna. I mean, you've emphasized the depth of the challenge. It is not just about what we see at the surface of clinical trials, but it's a systemic one. I'd like to also kind of broaden the question because, Dr. Aluko, if I may, you are the one that said to me, it's not always about race, it's about place. So it's not just about the racial inequities or ethnic inequities, it's geographic, it's socioeconomic. And in fact, I know at Medable, we say it's researches for every body and biology. And so there's also a genetic element to this. And so as I transition to Yele or Dr. Aluko, I'd like him to not just give us the breadth of his background, but perhaps also help us broaden that discussion.
So yes, there has been a pervasive myth that healthcare disparities are predominantly driven by genetics and that Black and brown people are more predisposed to increased penetration from diabetes, hypertension, obesity, you name it, because of their genetic makeup. And that is a myth. The reality is that the risk vulnerability that Black and brown people encounter is based on the social determinants of health. We talk about it not being just about race, but place. Talk about places people live, where they grow up, where they go to school, where they worship, and what resources to mitigate health risks are available within communities. For example, there is this context of racial segregation within communities that has perpetuated over centuries. And there's also the observation within those communities, there are not as optimal opportunities to get good education, to get access to good food, to develop health literacy, financial security, housing security. And these all drive risk, brings the context of place beyond just race. But I do want to pick up on what Ken said. The findings around COVID-19, the outcomes disparities broadly, and the lack of diversity in research, more specifically in clinical trials, this is by no means new. I just want to emphasize that this is not new. This has been studied, roadmaps have been written, strategies have been recommended as far back as 20 years ago. In my career, I've seen time and time again a general reticence to discuss this sensitive topic. And the pharma industry has been very aware of this for generations. But still yet, just being willing to understand and embrace the validity of the historical genesis, mistrust in clinical trials, it's been viewed skeptically for the most part and ignored by mainstream health sector. There's a long history of medical experimentation on Black and brown Americans. This is a painful legacy of distrust, and we need to embrace this. We need to explore it. We need to understand it, appreciate it with empathy. So going forward, this needs to change. Inclusion strategies must include the awareness of the history, the empathy that must come from that, and evolving of a deliberate strategy to embrace the scientific value of representative trials within, broader demographics.
Sans, could I just pick up on that? I could not agree more with the comments that my fellow panelists have made. And I just want to reiterate again that reticence, as you mentioned, Yele, the pendulum swings. About 10, 15 years ago, we saw elevated and renewed interest in addressing disparities and improving equity and inclusion in our trials. And over time, that level of interest and investment waned. Now we are seeing renewed commitment, and we're seeing even the creation of functions within organizations dedicated to addressing these challenges. But we run the risk again of dedicating our energies to the problem, but not addressing some of the most foundational areas. And as a result, we'll see only a marginal impact, and we'll then devote our attention elsewhere. So we really need to understand this problem and so many of those foundational areas that we're touching on, and we need to think even more creatively about ways to address them. I think some of the virtual and remote solutions that have been introduced and facilitated, particularly during the pandemic, begin to address some of the access issues. So there are some structural and foundational ways that perhaps the drug development environment is changing. We're on the cusp of improving transparency and disclosure with renewed interest in plain language information so that the public can really understand technical scientific information. We need to do so much more to build strong connection to influencers within our communities at the very local level, really deeply within the community, to address so many of the social determinants that Yele had just mentioned.
Mm-hmm. I didn't mean to actually bring this up in our conversation, but the politicization, so the politics rather, that surround our communities as well has a part to play in this. So we'll not go deep into that, but all of you have mentioned, that this is not a new problem, that actions have been proposed to be taken, and yet perhaps we have been unsuccessful at achieving the outcomes that we need to achieve. So we're going to start to talk about those actions that we must go ahead and take. But one thing I've learned from this so far is it's not just about the deliberate action. It's also tying that action to the scientific outcome that's going to bring stakeholders together. Because in fact, it's not going to be just a social discussion. It's going to be one that we have to prompt as well for the efficacy, safety, and impact of our treatments that should be delivered ethically. So as we consider those and the challenges you have all communicated, what I'd like to understand from you, and we'll begin with Yele on this question, is what are the initiatives you are undertaking in your organizations that you have focused on to demonstrate a specific improvement in these challenges?
Yes. So EY, Ernst & Young, where I currently serve as Chief Medical Officer, is a professional services firm. I also am the director for the EY Center for Health Equity. And we provide solutions to all stakeholders in the value chain. Now, through the EY Center for Health Equity, specific to biopharma, we provide biopharma organizations and healthcare providers with a holistic spectrum of competencies that enable them to be best positioned for real and sustained impact in the elimination of health disparities through the lens of a health provider, but through the lens of biopharma, best positioned to develop business models that are successful in diverse enrollment. Now, but we start with ensuring that, as I said earlier, that there's a true understanding around the genesis of health disparities and the drivers that insidiously perpetuate them today. Sans, you touched on politics. When we talk about the social determinants of health, I will say that the social determinants of health are put in place by what's being called now the political determinants of health. Yeah. So back to the solutions we offer. We offer these solutions across a broad spectrum, starting with strategy, customized to respective stakeholders in the healthcare value chain, and very specific and granular solutions relevant to re-engineering specific business models in biopharma, healthcare providers, payers. In biopharma, like I said, so doing results in being positioned to be held accountable to execute on diverse representation in clinical trials, ensuring that the drugs and devices that are brought to market have been tested in all populations that they're intended to be used within.
Absolutely. Yeah, having worked in biopharma for the last 20 years or advising, that it is the core of the science, right? And the responsibility in drug development. And so with that in mind, Sapna, you are a representative of this industry, delivering some of, the most innovative medicines today. How is your organization, or how are organizations like yours taking this accountability and influencing regulators and others who biopharma needs to influence in some ways to make some of these changes a reality?
Yeah, so Sans, I just really love what Dr. Aluko mentioned about the inclusivity of clinical trials, and we really took a look at our own report card, and 88% or so of genomic data that's available is Caucasian descent genomic material. When we look at, even when we looked at our own clinical trials, our report card wasn't good. And so last year when COVID happened, we were placing clinical trials in the space of COVID pneumonia. And many of us observed that, one, we weren't going where the locus of the virus was, and two, we weren't going where diverse patients were. And a lot of it is the place where people live. And so the distribution, the geography, the zip codes, it's not, as Dr. Aluko said, it's not all, the myth is that it's all affordability for patients of color, but it is not. It is not affordability. It's often other determinants that play into this. So we started doing a lot of mapping in terms of where do patients live, work, worship, and play. Who do we engage with to draw patients in to overcome or to at least address that crisis of trust? So I'll give an example here. It's not enough just to place a solution in a community that you want to include into clinical trials. So, if we go out and put a mobile bus for mammography, for example, in a heavily Latinx neighborhood, the first year we would have, lots of women coming out and get all these scans and come out, and you think you have a great success rate in terms of diagnosing and screening patients. But then the next year you hear back and there's a much lower screening rate in those patients. And what we learned is, well, those women that were in the community were saying, you go in the bus and you come out and you have cancer. So at the end of the day, we want to have interventions, even if they're the most well-intentioned interventions, that are well understood by the community that we wish to serve. that we are well networked in those communities with those physicians. And patients have told us they want doctors who look like them, who understand their culture, who can understand that perhaps sometimes the patient is not the decision maker. In some Vietnamese families, for instance, we've seen that someone else in the family is the primary decision maker on whether to participate in a clinical trial. So we have to understand the cultural nuances when we ask and when we present information to patients. So these are all things that we're building into our clinical trials. We're building in patient navigators. We're building in diverse. We have a questionnaire that we've sent to sites to ask how diverse is your coordinators and your staff. As you mentioned, Dr. Getz, we ask that because we want to spur others to action. Similarly, our suppliers, we have a $1 billion commitment to diversify our supply chain. So built into the RFP process, we ask, how diverse are you? What are your principles? Who do you have on your board? We ask that question all the time. It's not enough just to have one person that is brown or black on the panel. We want really to see well-represented groups of thinkers within the space of research that understand and are solution-oriented. So these are some things that, that we've really worked on with intentionality in the last year.
Thank you, Sapna. And, when we think about each industry often acting as each company often acting as an N of one, we really need to act together. We saw immense collaboration in the last 2 years. I would hate to see that dissipate because of either lack of urgency or going back to orthodox ways. Ken, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah. Well, first off, I just want to say and echo what Sapna had mentioned, that there's a tremendous amount of interest and intent at the organizational level to address the current operating environment and situation. And so there are so many great initiatives that are underway. Our role is really to measure the impact that a lot of these initiatives are having. And at times we also gather baseline data that can be used to assess in the future whether we've made a measurable difference. And to points that were made earlier, often we don't see broad-based improvement when we look at the macro level at the enterprise as a whole. So just to give you a flavor for some of the areas that we look at, I mentioned early on in our discussion that we do capture at the macro level the diversity of investigative site personnel, and we can actually measure changes in that diversity over time. We've been looking a lot at the adoption of decentralized clinical trial solutions to see what role and impact that may have over time. And in particular, we're looking at the value that that the use of DCT solutions can deliver to a drug program, a development program. So we're trying to create a sense of return on investment for various initiatives at the enterprise-wide level. We spend a lot of time looking at regulatory reforms and regulatory, the lack of regulatory clarity and the role that that plays. So we provide a bit of a report card there. And as we noted earlier, we do see that not only is there a lack of data that really articulates and characterizes race and ethnicity in our pivotal trials, but we also see that even in those areas where regulation has now been put into effect, like the disclosure and transparency of clinical trial results in plain language, let alone in technical language, we also see very low levels of compliance and very limited enforcement. So these are some of the work that we do really informs the role that regulation could play in improving transparency and disclosure and helping to build trust. One other area I want to touch on is the work that SysGrip, my nonprofit organization, is doing, and it's playing a very large role in helping companies like Genentech, Roche, and others translate clinical trial results summaries into plain language. And we're seeing a lot of interest among pharma to do this, but most organizations have really approached it at more of a pilot level at this point. And so we're really encouraging more broad-based use and adoption of plain language summary disclosure. SysScript focuses a lot on media outreach, educational initiatives that target minority communities through the media, and that also engage community centers and influencers to provide education. So we distribute a lot of very, very targeted and carefully developed educational materials, including digital, social media, as well as even video where appropriate. And lastly, we also conduct a lot of patient input panels, patient advisory panels, where we specifically solicit input from communities of color to really respond to a draft protocol and to comment on ways that that protocol could be improved and ways that the eligibility criteria, for example, could be modified, as was mentioned earlier. We also do a very large global study every 2 years of about 13,000 people to really monitor changes in attitudes and perceptions and experiences in clinical research and how they vary by a population subgroup, by race and ethnicity. So all of this is really intended to inform and also to monitor progress that's being made.
Thank you, Ken. You know, you've all demonstrated the specific actions that your organizations are taking. I think you've also all emphasized that it's going to take the community of us to make those changes a reality so that that pendulum doesn't continue to swing in a way that is not going to create realizable benefit to science and to humanity. So I'm going to ask all of you to make some radical proposals. Let's not worry so much about how pragmatic it is, but rather from what you have learned, what you want our industry, our regulators, our patients, our physicians to do moving forward. Many of them are in our audience also asking some of these questions. What do we tell them to do? What are the radical changes we are asking each other to make? Yele, let's start with you on this one.
Yes, so tongue-in-cheek, I will say that the proposals are not necessarily radical. I say that because there's an underlying theme that drives all of this. And I did say there's a reticence to talk about it and to embrace the reality around the systemic bias that drives everything we're talking about. So when we say radical, the radicality around it is the pain that is going to be required to discuss it collectively as a societal solution. But I will say that one word as a proposal would be accountability. Accountability from outside of biopharma must overwhelmingly occur. And what do I mean by that? I think Ken alluded to this. There should be a regulatory expectation of accountability at the highest level. The FDA, the NIH should now be prepared to actively hold all US-based clinical trials that are involved in research must be held accountable for representative clinical trial participation. So that's from the macro level. Next, there needs to be accountability from inside biopharma and within clinical trial organizations. This must occur in a systematic manner. And how does one do that? So we at the EY Center for Health Equity feel very strongly that there needs to be enterprise-driven health equity strategies. We've talked about a lot of initiatives, which are good, but oftentimes there are multiple initiatives that occur within large businesses, and we have representatives from global biopharma companies here. There are multiple initiatives that may not be harnessed under the umbrella of enterprise strategy. Oftentimes they are redundant, duplicative. So we like to take a step back and advise our clients in the C-suite that there need to be enterprise strategies. So biopharma will do well to adopt that position and have accountable entities within the C-suite that drive this sentiment and this culture throughout the business, overseeing all activities across all therapeutic lines in biopharma. Develop processes and initiatives that entities are held accountable for. This involves the board of directors. Board of directors must be prepared to hold their C-suites accountable for execution. Executive sponsors in the C-suite, developing strategies, tactics, systemic education, effective multicultural marketing, a willingness to re-engineer clinical trial design to meet people where they are. We've mentioned decentralized clinical trials. There's a large opportunity there. But absent of an enterprise strategy, the trial platform will perpetuate the current template of increasing enrollment in general and speed to execution without changing the complexion of the clinical trial participants.
Yele, I love what you just said. You know, and I think it's so true. We have to look at driving everything from the top, as well as looking at the frozen middle, you know, within organizations. And I think in order for this change to be lasting and sustainable, it has to come from the C-suite. It has to come from the board, the officers of the company. And so those are systemic changes that we've actually made and continue to make. In fact, we have asked all of our officers to incorporate either an inclusion or a health equity goal into their officer action plans, and we're measuring those. We are measuring progress on them. We're measuring, you know, what that looks like, and year to year, we're asking them to be accountable to these goals. So I totally agree that that needs to happen in order for these actions at a patient level to change. And then there's also the issue of money. You know, we must put our money where our goals are. And so that's another area that we are keenly focused on is we must, you know, continue to invest in this work at a community level. So for the upcoming year, we're actually encouraging and sponsoring a number of regional health equity symposia where we don't actually have any therapeutic area of interest. It's not centered around our products or our trials. And we're encouraging community stakeholders within particularly the African-American and Latinx communities in the United States to come together and bring policymakers, bring you know, chambers of commerce, bring payers, bring patient advocates along and have the discussion about, you know, what are the issues that are most pertinent, that are rising to the surface, that are crises of care. So in a rural Georgia, for example, it may be maternal fetal mortality. And, you know, we know based on the WHO, maternal fetal mortality is an indicator of overall economic status. It's an indicator of GDP. So if we can raise that boat, then all other boats, you know, the boats of cancer and the boats of other things will also raise along with that discussion. So we're sponsoring a number of those events next year in particularly medically disenfranchised areas because we want to be part of that conversation and understand issues that are not just issues tied to our therapeutic areas of interest.
Thank you, Sapna. Before we get to Ken, I wanted to emphasize a few points that were made. The reality that for sustainable change to occur, it is quite perhaps radical that we ask every part of the organization to create metrics, investment, and accountabilities to do this. I happen to represent a leading decentralized clinical trial company, but most of my life I've spent in industry. And so one thing I can say is that the resistance is not in the outcome. Everybody wants the outcome. The resistance is in the mindset and having the understanding of the changes, the accountability, the actions, having the investment to make those changes. And as all of you have said pretty clearly, it's not limited to clinical research. Research is a modality by which we interact with people around the world to empower them to be part of science and healthcare. For the first time, as we bring these digital methods to over 60 countries around the world, we embrace the unknown entirely in that perspective, and we see the opportunity. So with that, Ken, I'd like your perspective here as well. I mean, radical is an interesting word because even the smallest things today appear radical. As we mentioned earlier in a prep session, we don't even require that we collect demographic data for all clinical trials. How is that not a requirement? So in this industry, perhaps the obvious can be radical as well.
I will just piggyback on what my colleagues have mentioned. I strongly agree with the comments that have been made, and I'll just add to them. Accountability is so critical here. Senior management, the C-suite level support and putting investment, sort of the economic commitment is there. And I'll just add to something that you alluded to, Yele, where you talked about so many well-intentioned initiatives, but that have been implemented in a very fragmented way. They've been very point solution based. Sapna, you mentioned that many of these in the past have been trial specific, and we have to look without a specific therapeutic area of focus. There's been a very short-term interest in impacting diversity, equity, and inclusion in our studies, and we have to kind of break that thinking and dedicate ourselves to really a long-term commitment here, where there's real continuity in our initiatives, where we focus on general public and patient education and awareness as a collective, and we can really provide that level of support to address a problem that really impacts all of us. We need to dedicate ourselves as a community for the long term to really address this issue. Sapna, you mentioned something that has been very near and dear to us, and that is also really targeting children and young adults and really focusing on education of individuals in their formative years. That's such an important area where we can see long-term change in their relationship with the clinical research community and their knowledge and understanding about the important role that clinical research plays in public health. So, and our knowledge about disease and its progression and how to treat it. So there is a lot of opportunity for us to dedicate ourselves collectively to address this problem, where we can focus on broad-based solutions as opposed to those that are primarily specific to our organization and our organization's individual needs.
Thank you, Ken. We've had well, thank you to the panel. It's been a fantastic conversation so far. We have a few minutes left. And what I wanted to do is maybe combine two of the questions that we had addressed earlier. We asked ourselves, what is the long-term impact? And that also connects with one of the questions we've also wanted to address, which is, what does this world look like in the future if we apply what we know today to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in new models, whether that's with DCT or other things. So let's start with Sapna here. And in your response also, if you could give your call to action for our audience, the actions we have to take to make that world possible, that would be certainly helpful. And also you've mentioned some of those earlier in the conversation.
Sure, I'd be glad to kind of think it through. Wouldn't we all like to just have a wish list of things we could check off and say, make this a global change, if only that were true. But we are making our attempts. And one of my observations, like many others, was just how reflexive and adaptive were we last year through COVID. It was a global pandemic, a global crisis affecting our economies, affecting our healthcare. And we were able to get emergency use authorizations. We were able to practice telemedicine, where in 2018, only about 20% of physicians were using telemedicine. Last year, it was booming. And we are somewhat returning back to that, where patients are coming back to clinic. And certainly the power of the human touch can't be underestimated. However, what I've observed is there are care deserts in parts of this country that are equivalent to, some other countries and lower and middle income countries outside the United States. Having lived and worked in Louisiana and in the Mississippi area, for example, in Mississippi, there are only a couple of MS trained neurologists in the entire state. So if we could open up the way that we operated during the pandemic and have, fewer statewide or interstate regulations for the practice of telemedicine, think about the impact we could have on, say, African-American patients who tend to present with higher levels of disability when they have MS. Why, yes, perhaps there are genetics involved, but there's that trajectory of the patient experience in navigating the system from having a diagnosis at a PCP that's questionable and then going to an MS trained specialist that can provide them adjunct therapy as well. So think about what we could do if we could open up those regulations just even a little bit and be more reflexive over time. The other thing that I think about quite often is around this demographic data issue. Yes, we definitely want to collect demographic data in all our clinical trials, and we certainly are doing that. We're also collecting and attempting to collect demographic data of our own employees. We want to diversify, the way that all our boards and our companies look as well. By 2050, America is going to be a minority majority nation. And so we want to be reflective of America. And when I think about, the data collection piece, how that data is used right now is very loose. So physicians, when I go into an office, may or may not collect that data. And I'm not really sure how that data gets used. But if we could incorporate that into quality measures, like we've incorporated other things for physicians, perhaps it would incentivize physicians to look at this data more carefully, to treat their patients more holistically, and then to have better goals in terms of treatment care, as well as offering their patients clinical trials that they don't typically get offered. And I want to underscore that this is not an affordability issue. Innovation is for everyone, and we need to be looking and thinking along those lines. So I would love to see more in terms of how that data is used and how our providers can also be incentivized to think more around this issue.
Thank you for that point. Data is critical to us and being accountable. And especially perhaps we could consider what real world evidence data capture around these particular areas of interest would result in. Off to you, Ken.
And I'll be very brief because I know we're running tight on time. I'll just pick up on what Sapna had said. I think those are great suggestions. And I would just add to that, in addition to more complete data, and that is actually tied to outcomes and quality, to also require plain language summary disclosure of trial results and other technical language, and really target or customize that information. And the last area relates to what I've been describing all along, public education and outreach, and just to really pour on our focus on customizing that information to individual communities and engaging critical parties, our influencers and our educators within local communities to help really build community engagement.
Thank you, Ken. And Yele, what is your view of the future and your call to action for our audience?
Well, I do believe that there's an evolving embracement of decentralized clinical trials. And we're yet to see the long-term impacts that will provide a more clarity in what the future world will look like. But there's tremendous potential with DCTs because, as Sapna said, parallel with the adoption of virtual health during the pandemic, interest in DCTs using digital platforms for enrollment in clinical trials has very subtly but boldly begun to facilitate the re-engineering of clinical trial design in of itself. I'll be using virtual tools that are less dependent on the traditionally more mundane and oftentimes manual processes. DCTs can simply bring speed to execution of broader demographics of diverse clinical trials across the world, from screening, from enrollment, follow-up, avoiding reliance on manual processes of data collection within traditional research facilities, in-person visits, and it goes on and on and on. Now, my call to action, and I'm going to be repetitive because I do feel that all of this is dependent on regulatory reform and accountability. And I will state again that at the level of the FDA, NIH, and other organizations that oversee and adjudicate clinical trials, we will be having, absent of that process change and responsibility of accountability that needs to be put in place to demand diverse enrollment, we will continue to have academic conversations. So accountability for me is a key priority as a call to action.
Thank you, Yele. Thank you to our panelists. You have given us some very clear actions to take as audience members, as part of this community. This is not the last time we will have this discussion. This is one of many. And we hope both you panelists and the audience will join us in the future to ensure that these actions are taken and become a reality. So thank you again on behalf of the Galien Foundation, Jerusalem Ethics Forum, and Medable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.